I'm reasonably familiar with Richard Herring's backstory from having enjoyed much of his previous work, and consequently for the longest time I'd always assumed that the inspiration behind his annual marathon bouts of cracking the exact same joke with such an obvious jag did at the very least originate from relatively noble intentions. Some critics think that he very consciously and cynically jumped on the fourth wave feminism bandwagon during its most hashtag trending time, and has succeeded in making a day that's all about women at least a little about himself. And ironically, a whole lot more about International Men's Day than it ever really was, to the extent that for the last few years at least, he's even got International Men's Day trending on social media on International Women's Day. Certainly there will have been a bit of commercially minded cynicism involved, at least at some stage along the timeline of the history of Richard Herring's joke with a very obvious jag. But in my experience, things are rarely that simple, and as ignorant as his joke has always been, for quite some time I like to think that at least his intentions must have been relatively sincere. But then again, by now I'm more than a lot less more unconvinced. Interestingly, his whole Wazik-infused International Men's Day routine isn't actually his first foray into Awareness Day-based comedy, and arguably it's not even his most enduring, because over 20 years ago now, he invented a similar-ish but also kind of opposite imaginary 24-hour period of observance that at least a small number of people actually celebrate to this day. Here's a recent example.
So, it's February 15th, which means it's St. Skeletor's Day. As such, I've decided to celebrate it in the traditional way of destroying... Well, I've decided to destroy this old Valentine's card I got from my my ex-girlfriend. Obviously, it's got a message inside, a little poem, which I'll read out now. It says, "You're in my thoughts and in my heart wherever I may go. On Valentine's Day I'd like to say I care more than you know." Now, some of you might be wondering why I still have this card. The answer to that is very, very, very simple. Basically, when she gave it to me, I kept it for sentimental values. And when she broke up with me, I kind of just threw it in a drawer with all the other cards, birthday, Christmas, etc. that I've gotten from various friends and family members over the year. Right, so on to the festivities.
For the uninitiated, St. Skeletor's Day is observed annually on the day after Valentine's Day, February the 15th, and is intended as a celebration and consolation for all the bitter, lonely, single people who didn't get cards the day before or on any Valentine's Day ever.
St. Skeletor's Day, a festival dedicated to the destruction of love, saucy greeting cards and people with girlfriends.
So, no Valentine's Day gifts for Rich this year then?
Its inspiration came from Richard's own long-standing and often stated hatred of St. Valentine's Day itself, primarily arising from the feelings of despair and inferiority that it invokes amongst those of us who are perennially unlucky in love, but also because of the fat cat capitalist nature of the day itself, which means that it also puts enormous societal pressure on people lucky enough to be in a relationship on that arbitrary day of the year. And by people, I'm pretty sure that Richard really meant puts pressure on men to spend enormous amounts of money on non-spontaneous and therefore relatively hollow but often overpriced romantic gestures, like a bunch of roses, a swanky meal, or in Richard's case, a debts currently standing at over 2,000 individually wrapped luxury hazelnut chocolates. Those who celebrate St. Skeletor's Day, and according to their Facebook page there are more than a few, are understandably enough furious about the existence of St. Valentine's Day, because to them it amplifies and reminds them of their own feelings of loneliness and despair. And as a consequence they actively and overtly campaign for the abolition of that day, based on the logic that for those of us blessed with all the looks and the good fortune to be lucky in love, every fucking day day of the year is essentially St. Valentine's Day. Its replacement in the February calendar would instead be a day for all the lost and loveless souls and become an annual devotion to the destruction of love. To quote Richard, if anyone is seen even holding hands on this unholy day, you're allowed to push them both in a puddle. Anyone who's had sex this calendar year gets put in solitary confinement. If there's someone you really hate, you can send them an elaborate, expensive and anonymous card going into the details of why you think they're so and meet us. But the real selling point is, if you're in a relationship that you're not happy about, on St. Skeletor's Day, you're allowed to just walk away from it, with no explanations, no repercussions, and crucially for some people, no reparations. And by people not paying reparations, Richard clearly means men. Incredibly, this philosophy essentially elevates Richard Herring to the status of patron saint for incels, and establishes him as a surprisingly early yet ultimately failed subscriber to the discipline of men going their own way. The hordes of so-called and mostly imaginary furious chauvinistic cheese helmets that he wages battle with every year will no doubt recognise the incredible irony of this revelation. But incredibly and ironically, this isn't actually the most curious thing about the curious origins of Richard Herring's joke with such an obvious jig. Indeed, incredibly, it's not even the most ironic, because it just so happens that we have at least another 2 layers to peel. As I've mentioned earlier, Richard's monumental feats of click-based virtue signalling did coincidentally coincide with the high tide of fourth wave feminism, but despite this, I still used to assume that his motivation had at least as much to do with love. Because both his joke with a jig and the Twitter-based activism that followed it both evolved over the same period that the good ship Herring finally reached safe harbour and even added to its crew, at least metaphorically speaking, in a metaphorical sea of love. Because after a well-documented, often lonely and loveless journey, Richard finally got lucky in love, tying the knot in 2012 and quickly thereafter becoming a dad. The lucky lady in question self-identifies as feminist, and his firstborn just happened to be a girl. All of which in fairness led me to assume that his change of direction and perspectives on annual days of observance, imaginary or otherwise, were a reflection of the happy changes and changing priorities in his own personal life. One thing that goes some significant way to supporting this theory is the fact that he hardly ever mentioned International Women's Day in his daily blog before those 2 significant life events came along, or feminism or feminists for that matter, apart from strangely when he was obsessing about stealing their underwear. That being said, the fact that he did mention it once just happens to go some significant way to suggesting possibly less altogether altruistic and altogether more cynical motives behind his joke with such an obvious jig. Because if you've watched the short history of Richard Herring's joke, then you may recall that he first started defending the honour of international women all around the world on March the 8th, 2013. But curiously or coincidentally, and much to the annoyance of some network feminists, he sort of slightly but definitely sort of slagged it off the previous year. Here's an excerpt from his blog. International Women's Day, a whole 24 hours where it was important for us to treat women as if they were equal, before then getting back to normal tomorrow. Though they also have Mother's Day coming up, how many days do these bloody women want? And why put the 2 they have so close together? If you include Valentine's and February the 29th, which is the one day every 4 years they can force men to marry them, they have 4 days in the space of little over a month. Then nothing for ages, which shows the poor planning skills of the female brain. When I posed this tongue-in-cheek question on Twitter, forgetting that it's not a place for subtlety or sarcasm, a lot of people told me women should have every day of the year as their celebration. But in fact that would be foolish. If we celebrated every day, then that would become the norm and there would in fact be no celebration. I tried to parody the people who complain about charity money going abroad by tweeting, "I hate International Women's Day, when we have loads of women in the UK who need our help." I was quite proud of the satire, plus the underlying misunderstanding of the day that it was about women needing men's help. and thought that surely anyone following me would know that this was a joke. I was wrong, it turned out. Comedy is a difficult business. It would be better if the government would institute my scheme to execute anyone who failed to understand my jokes. Very quickly, we'd get down to a hardcore of people with a brilliant sense of humour, and everything would be fine, though I might get a bit lonely on my own. Now, the hordes of so-called and mostly imaginary, furious, chauvinistic cheese helmets that he wages battle with every year will no doubt recognise the incredible irony in the fact that the internet once told Richard Herring off for publicly declaring that he hates International Women's Day, especially when he even went and did it on International Women's Day, no less. But incredibly and ironically, this isn't actually the most curious thing about the curious origins of Richard Herring's joke was such an obvious jibe, because if we fast forward to July of the same year, we find Richard apparently unsuccessfully trying to dig himself out of a rape-shaped hole. The rape-shaped hole in question had appeared a few days earlier in his weekly column for London Metro, which quickly disappeared down a metropolitan-shaped memory hole after various public complaints, but not before it caused a minor Twitter storm, as documented in the New Statesman and The Guardian, amongst others. A Twitter storm involving, amongst others, famous feminists Laurie Penny and Owen Jones, and an exchange involving the latter even appears to document the exact moment when Richard first publicly self-identified himself as a fully fledged feminist, which, much like the crusade he started a few months later, does strike me as rather curious timing indeed. Mind you, the ironic thing about the curious origins of Richard Herring's joke was such an obvious jag is that, believe it or not, the fact that within a matter of months he was publicly admonished for telling jokes about rape and for declaring to the world that he hates International Women's Day, and the fact that he invented a day of observance to honour all the lost souls who involuntarily have to go their own way, is not the most ironic thing about Richard Herring's joke was such an obvious jag. That, my friends, is an altogether more nauseating and shameless tale, and requires another video entirely.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.